I'll be here.
Good. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I have a quick schedule change for our lecture series. Our speaker for March 16th, whose name escapes me right now, is not going to be able to appear, but we have the good fortune of having our dean, Carl Daubman, filling in. So we're going to be spreading the word in the next couple of weeks, but please also do it on your own. Tell your friends, tell everybody that the dean will be speaking on the 16th, telling us about his research and other things. But tonight we're going to be hearing from one of our own, Constance Bodurow. She's an associate professor of architecture here and the founding director of Studio CI, which is a transdisciplinary design collaborative in Detroit. She's a registered planner and a certified urban designer with over 20 years of practice, teaching, and research experience. Constance holds a BFA in industrial design from Michigan State University and master's degrees in planning, and urban design, and architecture from MIT. Tonight she'll be discussing the work that arose from her sabbatical from 2015 and 2016. During that sabbatical, she held 2 visiting scholar appointments, one at the MIT Center for Advanced Urbanism and one with the University of Virginia's Biophilic Cities Lab. Professor Bodurow's research addresses design opportunities related to net zero energy, generative uses for vacancy, and hybridized infrastructure networks at the scale of the structure, site, neighborhood, city, and bioregion. Professor Bodurow has held visiting appointments in Asia, the European Union, and North America, and her research has been funded by numerous organizations and foundations in addition to LTU. She's published in a variety of venues and also has authored a chapter in an upcoming book to be published by Taylor and Francis. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Constance Bodurow.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you to Chair Geyer, and thank you to all of you for attending. It's very kind of you to be here. It's a pleasure for me to be invited to speak to you and share my sabbatical experiences. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Putting together this presentation has been really interesting to review sort of all the wonderful experiences and some of the chaos that goes on during anyone's year. And I think the timing in the spring versus sort of the rush of the fall has really given me a little more time and a little more perspective. So, Dale gave such a comprehensive introduction. I'll just get started. The college would like me to display these slides about AIA CES. And this is not a mistake because Tammy is actually going to be developing these learning objectives, and maybe if you could give her some input after the lecture. I wasn't convinced there were any learning objectives, but hopefully there will be a few that come out of it. So I've called my talk Sabbatical in Motion, and if we look at the definition of sabbatical in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's derived from the Sabbath, so essentially about rest. So it's a bit of I guess the title is a bit of a contradiction, but hopefully through my presentation you'll see and understand why I characterize it in this way. Thanks to e-learning as well, particularly Scott Lehman, I've got sort of a dual presentation going here. So the lower premiere window is going to be a time-lapse sequence that will run throughout my lecture, hopefully not too distracting, that really speaks to the experience of the entire year. And then I'll make some key points in my PowerPoint presentation. So click spacebar. Matt, technical assistance from Matt. Awesome, thank you. So really fascinated with the notion of motion as well, particularly with the description of it as a verb, that it somehow related to the hand and the mind, particularly in relationship to a sabbatical. So I want to organize my talk in 3 categories, which I believe was distributed, to talk a little bit about drivers. So what are my motivations, or were my motivations, and the kind of processes and preparation that I went through, or any faculty member goes through, to pursue a year-long sabbatical? My experiences, as Dale said, that I was both at MIT and UVA, and had many opportunities to interact with many different individuals in many cities. And then talk a bit about outcomes. So how have I brought my sabbatical experiences forward and back to the college, and how might I, what are the potentials of that in the future? So as I was thinking about this and how to explain it to you, I decided to diagram it. This isn't quite done. I wanted to have a variety of flow lines that connected things. So I'm going to continue to work on this. But you know, a sabbatical doesn't just one day a faculty member decides to go on a sabbatical. Of course, the university has an entire process, so you have to start kind of 2 years in advance. But I would date my sabbatical way back to my days as a student at MIT. Bill Browning was one of my classmates, and he was at Rocky Mountain Institute at the time, but then he left there to form Terrapin Green. And I met him at a conference, and I was starting to teach sustainable urbanism and ecological issues, and he told me about Tim Beatley at UVA, so, you know, connected me through to Tim in the Biophilic Cities Lab, you know, sort of way back in 2014. Similarly, with the Center for Advanced Urbanism, Alan Berger, who's the current director, I've been following his work for years, and some of his work, like Drawscape and systemic design, have been very important to the development of my own work in Studio CI. And then in 2010, I was invited to teach in the Critical Practice Studio, which was then called Masterclass. And Alexander DeHuga was the visiting critic at the time. So I met Alexander then, and started as early as 2010 to start to talk to Alan and Alexander about coming to MIT and engaging with the CAU. So, you know, that arc started, you know, very early on, and then there are all sorts of seminal texts. I mean, most faculty will tell you, and this is the same for all of you as students, I would hope, you know, that certain scholars and certain texts are really going to influence you in your academic and professional careers. You know, Julie Thompson Klein, Hillary Brown writing about next generation infrastructure. These are all things that were coming into play as I was preparing for my sabbatical. You have to write a proposal, and most faculty at Lawrence Tech, the Lawrence policies, you can go away for a semester after so many years. If you ask for a year, you actually have to take half salary. That's the policy of the university. Every university is different. By the way, is this distracting or is it interesting? Interesting. Okay, both good. Okay. So I'm not going to really, you know, unless there's something major that you guys have questions on. I think a lot of it is self-explanatory. But, you know, I went back to read my objectives, and actually Dale was the chair of the faculty council at the time when I put my proposal in. You know, if I step back, I mean, and I reread this, this sounds like a faculty member who needs a break. You know, someone who's been teaching for 11 years straight without a sabbatical. Typically, it's every 7 years. Although I just saw a really interesting TED Talk by a designer who suggested that we should all take a sabbatical every 7 years. Like cut 5 years off our retirements and intersperse those years during our working lives. Seems like it makes sense. Anyway, so basically I said that I had 3 objectives. I wanted to really engage with globally recognized scholars, particularly some of the ones I've been talking about. Take a reflective pause and really catch up on the disciplines that I'm engaged with in teaching and in my design work. And then hopefully to advance my current design and research agenda around net zero energy, particularly in Detroit. So the university said yes, and I also was motivated, of course, by these two wonderful invitations. You can see the letters and the images of Alan Berger and Tim Beatley here, and very enthusiastic, sort of invitations, and it's hard when somebody really wants you to say no. So that proved to be, I think, a really big motivator. The other thing is they wanted to engage me. They wanted me, not just to come and hang out, right, but actually do some things. I think the ambivalence came in that I had an active design and construction project that I was directing and was the principal investigator for to build a net zero energy canopy in Detroit in conjunction with community partners. And with reassurances from my team that they would, I could remotely manage this and, to be determined. And with their support that they could pick up the slack, and assurances from my supervisors, I went off. So in terms of experience, there are a lot of coffee cups on this diagram. And I think one of the things I guess I took away as a major experience from the sabbatical is that all of the scholars and academics that I met at these two wonderful institutions were very generous and very open to new participants, new ideas, and I had a series of 30-minute coffees with so many wonderful people, more than I can name here or diagram, but I think maybe the only one that I didn't get to was Noam Chomsky. I really wanted to have coffee with Noam Chomsky at MIT. So in terms of experience, I began to call my sabbatical the new research triangle because I was literally living between Detroit, Boston, and Charlottesville, Virginia. It's not exactly equilateral, but close. And in support of the notion of sabbatical in motion, I did a bit of calculation of all of the round-trip flights and car trips among these various things. I should probably calculate the eco-footprint of this. But as you can see, there was a tremendous amount of back and forth. Again, you go away on sabbatical and your family doesn't go away, right? Your responsibilities in that way don't go away. So either I was traveling or they were traveling. Of course, the project here in Detroit. But hopefully I did manage to have enough quality time in these two places to accomplish a few things. So I wanted to talk just quickly about the two institutions, MIT and University of Virginia. How many have visited either or both? Okay, probably most to Boston. I know I have some friends that actually attended. I know Dale attended UVA. He did one of his degrees there, and gave me some good tips about restaurants. And I know we have some other colleagues that either went to Harvard or MIT, so no Cambridge. Now, again, I'm taking editorial license here because I'm characterizing these two places as quite different. Boston, of course, and MIT, extremely dense, developed urban area on the Atlantic Ocean. And Charlottesville, a smaller, lower density, more bucolic setting in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this one image on the side is a little unfair. Charlottesville is actually a really wonderful small city. But in comparison, there's huge cultural differences here. I won't go all through all these facts unless somebody's interested, but I think it's interesting that at MIT there are almost as many faculty and staff as there are students. Certainly, the sprawl of these campuses is very different. Again, MIT, very dense urban setting, and Charlottesville, more rambling and bucolic. And I'd say the cultural character, some of these images are when Professor Rost allowed me to use his family's home in the Berkshires. I have to thank him for that. But I think that the cultural differences really, MIT is just, when I was at school, we used to say it's like drinking from a fire hydrant. But I think for me, going back at this time in my life and career, I just saw it as an amazing banquet. It was like a feast, and there was just so much on any given day, so much opportunity. There was like this sort of urgency in the air, and electricity and urgency in the air. And you're sitting in a lecture, listening to them announce that they've verified gravitational waves, and knowing that somewhere on the other side of campus, probably in the media lab, they were advancing artificial intelligence. UVA is just as respected. It's the second ranked public university in the nation. But it has a much more genteel culture, and things, I'd say, no less rigorous, but certainly less intense. And Dale can jump in if I'm mischaracterizing. So again, the welcomes from both of these schools they were really wonderful. And they were so organized. As a visiting scholar, you're treated like an employee. And, going through all the battery of various things, and security checks, and, signed documents in terms, that you're not going to give up anyone's intellectual property. Life there is just easier, I would say. It's in either location are you dependent on the automobile, because there's so much redundancy in the non-motorized transportation system. So. Literally, this is all you needed to live, as long as you had money, because neither is inexpensive. So, and I became quite accustomed to this. So everything, the cards have become very high tech, as you might guess. So that little MIT card got me into my visiting scholar suite. It got me into any building I needed. It was a T-Pass. It was an ATM card. All I needed to add to that was my Hubway key, so I could rent a bike. UVA, as you see, is a little bit, they're on the ascent. They're working toward getting to one. But very dependent on apps, to get around and find out what's going on campus. So I would say just a much simpler and easier life, allowing, freeing up more time to think great thoughts and do great things. So one of the key things I was invited to do as a visiting scholar was in each institution participate in at least one major project. So basically what both Alan and Tim told me, they said, well, look, if you give us 2 days a week and then the rest of the time's yours. You structure your time as you want. So at the Center for Advanced Urbanism, when I wrote my proposal back in 2014, they originally thought that they were going to involve me in their Future of Suburbia conference, because Alan is very convinced that, Alan, as many of you know Alan, he likes to be provocative, and he basically, his theory is that, for the last 5 decades, we've dumped billions of dollars into cities through various federal programs, and we're no better off. So why do we continue to do that? Let's start focusing on the suburbs. That's where everybody wants to be anyway. So very controversial and provocative when so many of us in the design disciplines really, were obsessed with the city and want to be in the city and work in the city. So that initiative had advanced in a different way by the time I arrived. And so he said, oh, well, don't worry. Well, you know, he was very flexible. He said, we'll involve you in the project we're doing with the Masdar Institute in the UAE. And I said, okay, that sounds good. So I worked with a team in the Center for Advanced Urbanism on this joint study, really looking at the future of urban form and sustainable neighborhood form for Abu Dhabi, which was really fascinating. It's you know, the way in which they live, given the climate, the extreme climate, you know, there's virtually no public realm. All of if any sort of outdoor or recreational space is more contained in the courtyard of their housing topologies. But, you know, given everyone's probably familiar with the Masdar city and the Institute, Professor Al-Awad, who was Alan's partner in this project, basically works at the Masdar Institute, and, you know, which is Norman Foster's City in the Desert, right? That's all net zero energy. They actually have quite a few students living there, but not as many residents. Anyway, so they've started to focus on the historic part of Abu Dhabi and evaluating microclimate, evaluating these topologies, looking at global precedents. One of the things at the time when we were working on this, another faculty member at MIT wrote a paper that basically said that by 2050, the air temperature in the Middle East is going to be too hot for human habitation outside. So they obviously have an urgency to try to figure this out. And I was happy to be able to contribute to that project. And Alan and I and Professor Al-Awad had talked about hopefully a collaboration with Lawrence Tech in the UAE. Not sure if that is something that the college and the department are interested in, but I thought maybe students can tell us if you're interested. So then at UVA, I was asked to help structure the so-called Vortex charrette, which I think is kind of unfortunately titled. The University of Virginia School of Architecture does a all-school charrette. So think about this like for Lawrence Tech. You know, like we come here in January, we start day one in January, and all of you, students and faculty, are involved in a week-long charrette in the city. It's intense, and you're also starting classes too at the same time. So, but this is, they're thinking of doing this maybe once every 2 years. But it's really interesting. I found it fascinating how the entire population of the college and school come together for this. And they bring in a guest critic, much like they do for Critical Practice Studio, Hervoy Nijarek, who's Romanian and has done quite a bit of work in Europe. So I helped work with faculty, Manuel Bialo, who's the director of their urban design program at UVA, and others to structure the charrette. One thing I found fascinating is, when I first went to Charlottesville to visit, I had been there as a kid, probably most of you have too, to visit Monticello. I don't know if you had parents like mine, they wanted us to visit every national park. So we got around. But I had never really, been to UVA or Charlottesville for any extended period. And I thought, okay, how is my experience in Detroit, this, with all of our, rich and wonderful, industrial history and, challenges in terms of our, our regional polarity. How is that going to apply in a quaint little city like Charlottesville? Well, guess what? They're still very rooted in not just the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. So their polarity is still alive and well. And many many of the minority residents in Charlottesville and Richmond and others look at UVA as still as sort of the plantation. And so there was a lot of sensitivity around how do you go into the community and how do you engage the community. And I would say, you know, in my experience, that we're doing, I think, a little better job here at talking about these really challenging issues than perhaps they're doing in Virginia. Another, I guess, major expectation of both institutions was that I would deliver a public lecture. And so I did that in October at MIT and also in March at UVA. And when I again, sort of following on that issue of how relevant is Detroit and how interested are people going to be in Detroit, I was fascinated, you know, that so many people are still very interested on the East Coast, so very, very interested in Detroit and our condition. Can't tell you how many, you know, lunches or dinners I went to, and that's all, I was like quizzed what's going on in Detroit. And so I titled my lecture, A Year Abroad in Detroit, Transdisciplinary Design in America's Most Fascinating City, because there does seem to be still a great fascination with Detroit. I think it's evolved. I used to call it a morbid fascination back when Camila Vargaro got us all hyped up on ruin porn. But I think now it's become more substantial. I think people are understanding the issues or wanting to understand the issues in a more rigorous way. The reason I called it Year Abroad is one of my really good friends, when I left Boston to come to Detroit 15 years ago, told me that I would be back. He said, enjoy your year abroad in Detroit. And obviously I didn't go. I mean, I've gone back, but not to stay. I'd say a third major expectation of my sponsors was to engage with students. And I did that in a couple ways. I was introduced to a lot of the PhD students and made available to them. I also served on reviews. Alexander DeHuga, who I mentioned, who was instrumental in getting me out there, was very kind and engaged me in his fall and spring studios. And then, of course, doing final reviews with UVA in the spring. But after that, like I said, you know, they had these sort of set expectations, and then I was kind of on my own. So I went a little crazy. I audited 5 classes. I could only find 3 syllabi here. So at MIT, I audited a complexity seminar that Cesar Hidalgo was teaching. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's written a really interesting book, Why Information Grows. Highly recommend it. Then also geomorphology. I wanted to go outside like our design disciplines, and I had, you know, a couple years ago I took a registration exam to become a certified urban designer. And one of the study topics that APA gave you was geomorphology, and I thought, you know, I don't really know much about this. I got to find out about it. So took that in Earth and Planetary Science. And then they have an interesting seminar every fall. The PhD students organize this, Planning Ideas That Matter, and basically they invite their own faculty. They don't invite outside faculty, but they invite their own faculty to participate in these moderated panels on various topics that they've conceived that are planning ideas that matter. So that was fascinating, and it was a great way to sort of reconnect with professors I had and meet the new young batch of professors. One really great course I took in the fall, David Sue's Energy and Infrastructure Technologies. He had just joined MIT from Penn. I had followed some of his work, and turned out that some of his students were interested in doing some energy studies on Detroit, so that proved helpful to them. And then back at UVA in the spring, my faculty sponsor, Tim Beatley, teaches a Cities and Nature course. And he also asked me to make a brief presentation in that of the work we're doing. MIT has this thing called IAP, Independent Activities Period. It's the whole month of January they take off. And they give students that month off, but you can basically take any class you want. So like I took a Python workshop because everyone was talking about Python. I thought I better find out what this is about. And then other tutorials just to brush up on software. You can do anything. You can make you can build a drone. You can, throw a pot. There's all sorts of great things. So, like I said, I went a little overboard. This is it's a little OCD, I think, too. I am part German, so I'm going to blame that. I blame my German ancestors for the OCD. This is a progress report that I would give to Alan. I stopped doing it because he told me to stop. He said it was too much. So I would I had my, had my 3 objectives, right? And like I said, I felt like MIT was like this banquet, this feast. I had to just take advantage of everything. And so I was, scheduling coffees and going to seminars and symposia, and most everything is free and open. And then I did some traveling up and down the East Coast. I went and saw Mitchell Joachim in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and I, talked to a bunch of folks that are involved in rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy, and it was just an opportunity to do so much. And I think it got to a point where, I don't know how visible these are. One of the things I think you have to do when you take a year off is you can't just use your regular schedule, right? It's easy to fall into that habit. So when I first got there, I would go to the CAU every day, and I would think, oh well, I've got to be at the office, right, or I've got to be at school. And then slowly but surely, people would say to me, like, no, you can kind of go off and do your own thing. And then luckily, I had Alexander's advice too, as you see here, about this notion of creating a block of sacred time. And I think it's good advice for all of us that you really need that time for creative production. And so I don't know how clear it is. Finally, I'm embarrassed to say by November, I got those orange squares that say draw and write. I have to actually block it out in my calendar in between all the classes and all the different activities. And, I tried to take advantage of it. And I did draw and write. And, I think there was a sort of a liberation in having that block of time and allowing yourself that luxury, not expecting yourself to have to produce certain things all the time. And after Alexander gave me that advice, I also decided, this is great, you're having coffee with all these wonderful people like, Rob Stoner at the Tata Center and all sorts of, wonderful scholars, but I started to really try to focus in on a couple of mentors. Alexander de Huga, who I've talked about, to really talk to him about the kind of research and writing that I wanted to do. And then also Julie Thompson-Klein, who is right here at Wayne State. She's emeritus from Wayne State. In doing a little bit more research around transdisciplinarity, I learned that she's really a global expert. So you don't really have to necessarily leave your backyard. Maybe you have to go away and realize that kind of a person is in your backyard. But she's been a very generous mentor, and we continue to collaborate even to this day. Because I was between 3 places, this is spring. I had to sort of say, all right, where am I going to be when? Where are all the spring breaks falling? And so it was. I was definitely in motion. I'd say another major part of my experience at being at these institutions, and some of it I think comes from, like I said, that sort of just urgency and electricity that is going on in the environment. You start to hear words repeated, either in the halls or at the CAU or, in a lecture. And so I just tried to capture some of the things that were influencing me, that just being in those environments and around the academics and researchers and designers that I was meeting. And maybe one example of how this means anything, right, other than just a bunch of wonderful words. So what I discovered is physicists are really in these days. A lot of designers and artists are working with physicists, at least out at MIT and UVA. And I think it's because there's a lot of interest in entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. I myself do believe that the universe is governed by chaos. So I'm particularly interested in this idea of entropy or disorder, which can be, it doesn't have to necessarily be negative. It's negative when it comes to climate systems, but it can be positive when it comes to your metabolism. So this notion that time and space are quite different, right? That time is one-dimensional, the arrow of time, and space is three-dimensional. Of course, we all know that, we're designers. But that somehow the present doesn't exist in physics, right? The present is a human construct, right? There's only past and future for the physicists. And I was listening to this one particular talk, and the notion of the wave on the beach, as I have the image here, that we see that as a line or a boundary or a threshold, but it doesn't exist. It's just sand and water. So I actually want to do a studio on this. I think it would be a really interesting investigation. And then because of being exposed to all of these ideas and remarkable individuals, I did a lot of reading. That was one of my objectives, is to catch up. So here's a stack of books I read. Among them, like I said, was, you can see there, Why Information Grows by Hidalgo. Also Sustainable Urban Metabolism by Ferrara and Fernandez. A lot of these texts, now that I've been exposed to them, I've tried to work some of the readings and concepts into the teaching that I'm doing, hopefully to the benefit of students. Oh, and that's Barker Library. I spent a lot of time there. Building 10, Killing Court. Beautiful library. Time is up. All right. If you'll indulge me, I wanted to read something. So all of that writing and drawing resulted in a conceptual framework on transdisciplinarity, which has made its way into that book chapter that Dale announced. So I might just read some of these things because I find one of the things I learned over sabbatical is I explain myself much better in writing than I do verbally. So so we call our framework speculative normativism. It's really, this is a reflection and writing about our process of transdisciplinarity in Studio CI, which I've never had a chance to do over 8 years. In our experience, transdisciplinary design is essentially speculative, not merely responsive, reflexive, or reflective, as shown and others have proposed. I feel that in order to make the transdisciplinary mode of inquiry operative, we really need to keep an eye on relevant manifestation outside of the academy and in action in multiple contexts. I see a need for a comprehending vision which builds on indigenous critical mass and capacities, unites disciplines and diverse participants, allows for the integration of inputs and eventually co-production and successful manifestation. Maybe I'll read one more thing. As you see in the chart, I identified 5 capacities on the upper axis: visionary, technical, institutional, chaotic, and socio-political economic. The notion that capacity implies not only volume but power, both in individual and collective, justifies the terminology. Each of the 5 categories contain diverse and rich talents, inputs, and forces in general provide positive momentum to drive the transdisciplinary design progression forward. And then I might just read one more about flows, all those things that are connecting the various capacities and inputs. Nature reminds us that while matter cycles, energy only flows and is then converted from one form to another. Flows are illustrated in the matrix to acknowledge the limitations of two-dimensional diagramming in such a complex four-dimensional endeavor as transdisciplinary design. So I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to step back and think about the work we had been doing and to try to explain it, and sort of unearth it and reveal it, not only to myself but to a larger audience. And I'm very hopeful that I can continue on that trajectory of research and dissemination. I'm also thinking about I'm working with Julie Thompson-Klein and a few others to hopefully do a survey around the transdisciplinary method and the impacts it has had on my faculty colleagues and my students. So again, as we were doing all this work, we were also advancing the Net Zero Energy Canopy project in the community. And we were very excited in April to be recognized as an Architizer A+ award winner. That was super exciting for us. And there was it was an enormous amount of time and energy to manage the project remotely. As I'm sure those of you who have done construction projects are aware, best to be in place. So, but we had come to within 4 weeks of groundbreaking. We had purchased all the materials, and the fabricators were fabricating, and the GC was guaranteeing delivery by the groundbreaking date. And then all of a sudden, in the beginning of May, the community partner decided that they didn't want the project. So I actually had a little video of a nuclear explosion, but I'm not going to play it. So, I don't mean to make light of this, but because it was, all of our energies, we had a team of like 100 people, all of our energies were like moving in progression, like those charts I keep showing, up and up and up, and toward this actual finally getting this thing installed and built and giving us the opportunity to test, right? We wanted to test and we wanted to gather data. And, but like I said, the universe is governed by chaos. But we have this team of like over 100 people. So then all of a sudden all that energy, moving in that direction to get it implemented had to go toward, explaining this to everybody when you don't really understand it yourself. Thanking people and apologizing to people. So there was like an enormous amount of energy that just got sucked out of my sabbatical focus. But even so, this is a great quote from Alan, who was trying to cheer me up. And, when I think about, winding up with 50%, this is just an overview of like our partners and our funders and in-kind contributions. We had so many, so much goodwill and so many people involved. And, I'm happy to report that today we still have 75% of those people are still with us. So, I guess we bettered the 50%. And so I had many reactions to that, and like I said, I had to expend a lot of energy to address the things that were happening as sort of fallout. But I decided, okay, this is an opportunity to reboot, right? We're designers. We believe in our project. We believe in our motivations. We had reinforcement from community groups that what we were doing was of value. And thankfully, sometimes the universe delivers. And Caitlin Mueller at MIT, who runs the digital structures lab there, said, well, hey, I really am interested in this project, and I knew you were going to build that other thing, but here's a chance for us to collaborate. And so Drew Bradford, who some of you know, who's still associated with Studio CI, even though he's at the University of Michigan, he and I started collaborating with Caitlin and her PhD students to redesign the canopy and to look at computational design and digital fabrication methods. How can we achieve the performative goals that we had, but make this lighter, more beautiful, more affordable? And so we spent a couple months with them, and it was very encouraging. I think, maybe the lesson there, and for all of you, you're going to have obstacles, you're going to have chaos, you're going to have disappointment, but take what's good, take the seed of your ideas, and continue to carry on. And that's a duplicate. That's out of place. Those are the conferences I went to. I got to go to the Biennale too. Some of those upside down pictures are Venice. And I was with Professor Henneberry. These are some images of where were we? Lisbon, Portugal. So some outcomes. So other than being able to take the Henze canopy in a very different direction than what we thought we were going to implement, there were some other wonderful collaborations that came out of this, and I'll just wrap up so we can have a few questions. So one of my colleagues, Carl Seidman, had been doing some work in Detroit, had some funding and wanted to collaborate. So we got together for what we called the AIRS Studio, purposely called it AIRS because that's inheriting a legacy from another. And had a really wonderful, I thought, experience with MIT students, Carl, MIT faculty. I had 14 students from 2 courses, and the 48204 community was certainly really pleased with the results of this fall studio. And we are carrying that work forward now in ID5. I see Eric here, at least one of my students is here from ID5. And so I hope, I hope there will be future collaboration with MIT. We'll see, but it was a very successful run. This is another one. Kenneth Errol Reeves, former mayor of Cambridge, is the MLK fellow. He was MLK fellow while I was at MIT, and he extended his year. He's originally from Detroit, left Detroit at age 18 to go to Harvard and never came back. So now he's very interested. I'm collaborating with him on a symposium entitled Spirit of Detroit, 1950 to 2050. He wants to host an initial one at MIT in April, at the end of April 2017, with the hope of perhaps coming back and doing something next year in Detroit. But he's really interested in his notion of Detroit as a young person, back in the 1950s, and the notion of the new Detroit, right? And getting a lot of people in the room to talk about that. And as we've talked, I did publish the paper on transdisciplinary design framework. And also Cesar Hidalgo asked all of his students to publish on fold.cm. So even though I was auditing the course, I thought, why not take this opportunity? And I wrote a short essay on another interest of mine of urban spatial inequity and designing for equity. And I've also been asking a lot of my students to do essays published on Fold. If you're not familiar with this, interface was designed by MIT Media Lab students. And then here are just a few more things that might have promise. I would really like to develop an undergraduate course, seminar, or perhaps some more informal format on transdisciplinary design. And would ask you to give me your feedback on that, particularly students. A couple of my UVA colleagues, Susan Muma and Tim Beatley, want to collaborate in Detroit. We'll see what comes of that. Mitchell Joachim wants to figure out a way to get me to the Brooklyn Navy Yard so we can fabricate the Henze canopy there at his new lab that I'm sure you've all read about. And I was very honored at the end of my sabbatical appointment to be invited to join the MIT Architectural Alumni Board. And I'm the Midwest representative for that board. So if anybody's interested in becoming an MIT alumni, please talk with me. We're hoping to sponsor an event with, in conjunction with the ACA conference, but I'm not sure if that's going to actually happen. But so again, hopefully many outcomes, many other possibilities, and certainly a reminder, throughout the sabbatical of, not only the incredible privilege that I had, but I think a notion of responsibility and inspiration to actually go out and maybe try to affect the world like MIT and UVA aspire to do. Oh, and that studio on time. So please do contact me if you're interested in any of these ideas, transdisciplinary design, Studio CI, anything that I might have raised. We can talk afterward, or I've got my contact information on the screen. And I thank you all for your attention.
Do you have any questions?
Is there time? Oh, good.
Referring back to your... Okay, let's see if... Is this on?
It's so good.
Okay.
Online people.
All right. Referring back to your capacity mapping, the axes above the axis is, I believe, dispassionate, and below it, passionate.
Yeah, that's good.
What was the sort of rubric you used to determine what went on each side of that particular matrix?
That's a great question. Most of it was trying to identify what a more technically trained individual, such as ourselves as designers or academics, would bring to that co-production, that central territory of co-production. But it's not to say that the passionate contributions aren't technical. In many ways they are. But I think that was probably the key determinant. Were you trained in a design method or a transdisciplinary design method? Thank you for reading the chart. Oh, good.
Constance, did you just describe? Did you describe what transdisciplinary design means to the audience?
Oh,
I think that might be helpful to explain that and give a little more detail on that.
okay, let's see if I have that here. Hopefully I can read it. Okay, so we feel that our design method is transdisciplinary because we're characterized by a hybrid nature, tackling complexity, accepting local context and uncertainty, oriented toward action, addressing societal problems, but also contributing original solutions, bridging the gap between research and decision-making in society. And then further, immersive, collaborative, integrative design centered on a practice approach that expands the diverse design disciplinary boundaries to address complex systems and achieve urban sustainability through resultant design interventions. That's a long sentence. Oh, boy. Tiffany's got her hand up.
Okay, thank you, Constance, for your talk.
Oh, Casey, thank you.
My question is about your practice, Studio CI. I've noticed some signs just around the building, Studio CI, different locations in the building. You're also talking about that you were overseeing a construction project in downtown Detroit. So I'm just wondering if you'd talk a little bit more about your practice and what types of projects you hope to engage with, if there are certain scales or certain topics or
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, I founded the Design Collaborative in. I don't know if this is going to let us click it. Oh, sorry, I should have shown that. We actually just another outcome of the sabbatical was we just redid our website because I really felt like the website we had wasn't really explaining who we were and what we were doing. So I guess I could probably pull it up while I'm talking, but. You know, we were founded in 2008 around work we were doing in Southwest Detroit, and we've really, I think, expanded quite a bit. We do some consulting work. We've done quite a bit with the city of Southfield, for instance. We've, you know, which is more on a contractual basis, and then, but all engaging, you know, students here. But I would say most of the focus is about more research-based design practice and speculation around achieving net zero energy at the scale of the structure, site, and city. So, and I apologize, I can't bring up the site, but go to the website. Let me know what you think of the new website. See if it does explain itself. Well.
Hey, I haven't seen you since like an hour and a half ago. You talk about the Henze canopy and how it's changed over time. What materials have you guys gone from seeing maybe it's half an inch to maybe now using a quarter inch of different amounts of material or different materials entirely to make that more efficient?
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. This is one of the challenges of any sort of large collaboration. So when the project ended in May, the Henze canopy was comprised of a 1-ton upright and a 1-ton truss that the 1-ton upright was holding up. And so certainly now we've lightened it and reduced it considerably. But that was, you know, that decision, that design direction was really driven by the fact that we had been offered structural design services on a pro bono basis. And I think that, you know, we've gotten a little, I mean, free things are wonderful, and, you know, offers of free help and in-kind services helpful, but it doesn't always result, you know, in, doesn't always, you know, achieve what you're trying to achieve. So I think that it's been nice to be able to, you know, to really focus on the metrics that we think are important. So, and certainly the canopy that you guys are working with and looking at is quite a different animal than it was. You know, and when I recognized Derek, I should have recognized my co-professor, Tiffany Brown, in 95, who's also working with us. So did you want to, are you going to?
Yes, I have a question. Would you elaborate on the present as a human? Is this on? Because I couldn't hear people when they're talking. Oh. Hey, people. So would you just elaborate on what you mean by the present as a human construct and how that would help us, well, our students in studio or just in learning about architecture, period?
Well, I think we've made that space, right? We've associated, I think the point that I was trying to make is that we've associated space and time, right? We want time to be three-dimensional. You know, we want it to take up room. You know, and we want to be able to focus on it. And for it to have a, you know, have a presence in our lives. So yeah, I think that there would be a number of interesting, formal investigations around that, about how that notion of the present manifests itself in. Good. Let's teach that studio together.
Just one more question. Earlier in the lecture, you said that there was a professor that you disagreed with about why are we dumping all this federal money into cities when we should be going out to suburbs because that's where people want to be in the first place. What's your argument to stay in the city? What's bringing people to a city like Detroit that's slowly growing back to its former glory,
Right.
instead of going to areas like Royal Oak or Ferndale that are flourishing?
Well, that illustrious professor I disagree with was Alan Berger, and my sponsor. Well, I still fundamentally believe that the city is the most sustainable, most ideal place for human habitation, right? At its best, it's beautiful, it's equitable, it's culturally dense. But I think so much of my disagreement is that the suburbs depend on, right now, on a fossil fuel economy. And I just don't think that's something we can continue to assume in the next 100 years, in your lifetimes. So, unless we develop more robust notions, of public transit, and actually at the Future of Suburbia, they had the guy, what's the name of that super train that Elon Musk is designing? Yes, it's going to connect LA with Vancouver, right? So unless we start to think, I think, around those kinds of infrastructure investments, then I think we do have to think about more compact urban form. So that's my fundamental disagreement, is that it seems to be based on an assumption that things, the status quo can remain and that we can continue to drive. So, but, okay. I mean, it's a great question. It's much more complex. Not the least of which is, issues of equity, right? And that, can you choose to live in the suburbs?
So just based on the last question, you said your response was Detroit is a great fit for humans. Isn't it though kind of counterintuitive because it was built for mobile sort of cars?
Well, actually, you have to look at my 5x8 project. So there's this great. Do we have time? Can we keep talking? Okay. There's this great another physicist, Italian, Marchetti. There's this great. He has this great theory called the Marchetti constant, and you can look it up. So human beings throughout history will travel 1 hour from home, right? Whether they were walking, riding a horse, driving a car. We've probably exceeded that now because I know many people who drive more than an hour a day. But so and he said that sort of in the walking society, most cities were scaled at 5x8 kilometers. So, and that's the case of most, these quaint European cities that we all love, or ancient cities in Asia. Oh, is it going? I forgot to bring my cord. Tammy said, "Bring your cord." So I had a hunch. I said, okay, I wonder how big Detroit was originally. Because the original Detroit was within the Grand Boulevards until like 1930, 1927 is when we annexed all that other acreage. And so that space between the boulevards of Detroit is 5x8. So, and that's it. If you're interested in that, we can talk more about it. That's a project that we never really took too far in Studio CI. It was one of the more speculative ones that we did. But I've always been interested in thinking, okay, what if we just look at that 5x8 kilometer area of Detroit, our original city boundary, our original city wall, so to speak, how could we densify it, to accommodate population? So I mean, I live in the city. I agree, certainly I wouldn't equate the quality of life in downtown Detroit with the quality of life in Cambridge, that I experienced. But, I do believe in the city, and I do believe that it is the best place to live, both intellectually and personally. So.
All right, I think that's it. We can continue this informally if you're interested. But, thank you, Constance.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. Appreciate it. That was so nice. Thank you for coming. Oh.
Very good job.
Did I?
Yes.
I wasn't too boring.
No, you're fine.
I thought I was going kind of, yeah.